I'm Noor Kokiar. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State China Relations Council. We're pleased today to welcome Dexter Tiff Roberts to discuss his new book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Also joining us for today's webinar will be two former journalists and longtime students of China, Dory Jones-Yang and Andrew Batson. Well, much of the reporting on China focuses on the country's rapid modernization, how the country today is populated with new expressways, bullet trains, and glitzy new malls. This is not a complete picture of China. These monuments were built by rural laborers who were often exploited in China's rush to modernize. In his new book, Tiff investigates the roots of China's boom, tracks how rural institutions, communities, and people have been sacrificed for the sake of cities. Tiff challenges the notion that China's economy will grow at an ever rapid pace and questions whether China will be able to escape or conquer the dreaded middle income trap. So today, after I make introductions of our presenter and our panelists, Tiff's going to explain to us some of the key points of his books. Following this, we'll ask Dory and Andrew to provide some thought-provoking questions to clarify some of those points, and later we'll open the session for audience Q&A. Before I get started, let me briefly introduce the Washington State China Relations Council. Our organization is the oldest state-level organization dedicated to developing and improving relations between Washington State and China. Founded in 1979, we are a membership organization incorporating business, government, cultural, and educational entities, as well as individuals with an interest in China. Our activities include producing educational programs, managing delegations from China, consulting with the state and local government on their interactions with China, and working with the local Chinese community here in the state. We produce and co-sponsor webinars on topics of interest to our members. We have a few new webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks, and I'd encourage you to take a look at our website, www.wscrc.org, for more information. And lastly, I'd like to mention that our 41-year-old model of relying totally on memberships to fund our operation is not sustainable. With the slowing of trade and investment with China, the WSCRC's membership has decreased. We'd ask those of you who enjoy our productions and who are not members to support us through donating to our sister organization, the Washington State China Relations Fund. This organization can issue tax-deductible receipts for any contributions received. Details about this are on our website. And now I'd like to introduce our moderators, who will in turn introduce Tiff. Our first moderator today is Dory Jones-Yang. Those of you who have participated in previous WSCRC webinars should be familiar with Dory. In an October 1 book talk, she presented her new book, and on other occasions, she has moderated WSCRC webinars. Dory was Businessweek's first China correspondent, covering the early years of reform and opening from 1982 to 1990. Now based in Seattle, she wrote about those experiences in her recently published book called When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. Our second moderator today is Andrew Batson. Andrew is the director of China research for Gavekal Dragonomics, which is one of the world's leading independent economic research firms. He has been working on China since 1998, and before joining Gavekal in 2011, he was an award-winning reporter for the Wall Street Journal and for the Dow Jones Newswires in Beijing and in Hong Kong. Before I ask Andrew to open up and make some comments and introduce Tiff, let me remind all of you to please keep yourself on mute through today's sessions. We'll gladly take your questions. Please submit them through the chat box function. We'll look at the questions as we proceed and have a Q&A when we get to the end. And finally, I'd like to note that our event is being recorded, so if you want to review it later or recommend it to a friend, it will be available, and we can make that available on our website. So again, thanks everyone for participating today, and it's time to get started. So Andrew, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Noor, and thanks for asking me to introduce Tiff. I have to say, it's a pleasure and an honor. Tiff and I were foreign correspondents together in Beijing for a long time, but Tiff is, definitely my senior. He was, one of the people who was already, well established on the foreign correspondent scene when I showed up as a young cub reporter. And I have to say, as as a reporter in China, you kind of quickly get the lay of the land of what people are really up to, And it was, it's always clear that there are different types of reporters in China. There are some people who are kind of tourists. They fly in, stick around for a couple of years or a few months, make some big sweeping statements, and they fly out. And then there are people who are really dedicated to trying to understand China on its own terms and really ferreting out the story. And Tiff is very much in that latter category. I think he's been everywhere in China and interviewed everyone that I can possibly think of. And I think his book really reflects that that kind of on the ground approach to learning about China. There's a lot of shoe leather that went into that book, as you'll see when you read it. So I paid my own money to buy Tiff's book, and I have in fact read it from cover to cover, at least virtually, and I encourage you all to do the same. I think it's really provides a useful service in focusing in on China's working class and in showing us what life is like for this segment of the population, and really making clear kind of the the difficulties, the troubles, the challenges that these people face. So I found I've lived and worked in China for a long time, familiar with a lot of the issues that Tiff is writing out, but I still found it pretty enlightening. So that's all I want to say. So Tiff, why don't you talk about your book, and then Dory and I will harass you with some tough questions after you've had your say.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for such a kind introduction, Andrew. And I think you may have gotten the order reversed when you call me your senior. If anyone who does read my book, if they do read into the acknowledgement section, will see that I've thanked Andrew very prominently in there, and there's a very good reason. I was deeply reliant on Andrew's research. Well, first as a journalist, some of his great coverage, and then also his really, really good research as research director at GavCall Dragonomics. So anyway, very, very kind of you, Andrew. I appreciate that. I'm going to start, before we get to the fun part, the questions, I'm going to start with talking about the origins of how I came to write this book. And to do so, I'm going to show you some slides of the people and places that I feature in my book. Let's see if I can successfully share my screen. All right, here. So I'd like to start again, as I said, talking about the origin of the book. And to do so, I really have to take you back to the year 2000. So 20 years ago. I had been in China at that point for 5 years. And if you recall, and some of you, I'm sure, most of you are experts who probably remember this, the late 90s in Beijing, there was a lot of urban reform going on. Zhu Rongji launched the reform of the state enterprises in the cities, the so-called Zhuada Fangxiao, grasp the large and release the small state enterprises. There was also a phenomena of returnee Chinese that had studied in countries around the world, including the US, who are coming back to seize the opportunity of this rapidly reforming urban economy. And there was an internet boom, which the Wall Street Journal was writing about. And you had this phenomena of the returnee Chinese coming back and starting internet companies in the cities. And I was writing a lot about that. And I was enjoying that. And clearly it was a very important story. But things sort of changed for me in the year 2000. That was the year that I did 2 Businessweek covers that had a great influence on me and helped me realize just how important the world outside the cities of China and the interior of the country and the people from there was to the future of China. And those 2 covers, let's see here. The first one I've pictured here, again, I think this was in the summer, if I remember correctly, of the year 2000. As you can see, it was called China's Wealth Gap. For those of you who remember that era, then President Jiang Zemin had launched what he called the Develop the West program. And this was due to the fact that there was a growing realization amongst the leadership in China that Deng Xiaoping's reforms, although bringing great wealth and raising incomes in the country, were also leading to a worrisomely large wealth gap, particularly between the coastal regions and the interior. And so I went out, and that year, 2000, is the first time that I visited the then remote and quite poor, and still unfortunately quite poor, province of Guizhou. Later that same year, I enjoyed it so much, I found it so interesting, I went back again to do another cover story. This one was the Great Migration, and not surprisingly, it was about the already strong and fast growing in number migrant workers of China. And these, of course, were the then already couple 100 million people, young people, that were leaving those lagging interior parts and provinces of China and going to the coast, and then mainly to work in factories and on construction sites. And for this story, The Great Migration, I actually first went to Dongguan, as many of you know, the factory capital of China, the center of what became this sort of factory to the world model that drove growth in China for so many years. And while I was there, through some elaborate connections, I was introduced to these migrant workers who were all from the same village in Guizhou, a little village called Binghua or Binghua Village in the southeastern part of Guizhou, actually quite close to the Guangxi border. So first I met them, a group of about 6 of them. They were all surnamed Mo, all distantly related, in some cases first cousins, from this very small village. And the one here pictured on the cover is a young man, then a young man, I think he was 21, named Mo Rubo. And the young woman in the red vest in the insert part there, Mo Meiquan, his cousin. And both of them I got to know much better over the years after profiling them in this story. So I build my book, if you will, around these 2 places. And one is rural China, and particularly this village of Binghua, which you can see a picture of, a much more recent picture on the right, and this factory zone along the Pearl River Delta and the coastal regions more broadly. This picture on the left here is actually in Guangzhou, so up the river from Dongguan, where I had met the Mo's for the first time, and obviously the provincial capital there. That picture is actually of a SUV, workers at an SUV factory between shifts. Both these pictures are actually just a few years old, taken shortly before I left China, which was 2.5 years ago. Here's another picture of Mo Rubo, who I write about in the book. When I met him in Dongguan, he had left his village already, I think, for maybe 5 years earlier. So he left when he was a teenager, and he had already been a true migrant worker. He'd worked in Shanghai, he'd worked in Ningbo, not far from there, and then he had bounced around in a bunch of different jobs in Guangdong before he ended up working at this Taiwanese-owned electronic components maker, and as you can see here, was a welder in that factory. Another picture of Mo Rubo and his then girlfriend. I should note here that these photos were all taken by the great photographer of China and Asia, Greg Girard, who's actually just up the coast from you guys. He's now based in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's a Canadian, but lived for many, many years in Hong Kong and Shanghai. And I was blessed to work with him on a bunch of stories that he took for Businessweek. And he very kindly allowed me to use photos in my book that he had taken during some of those trips we had made together. They're black and white in the book, black and white photos, and it's a nice insert, and definitely adds to the book. So Mo Rubo's girlfriend was from a different part of China. She was from Henan, which, as many of you will know, was and is also a major source of migrants throughout China, and a relatively poor part of the country. Another couple pictures here from Greg Girard. This woman here in the same red vest is, again, Mo Mei-Chuan. And I was lucky enough to actually meet her in Dongguan, and she was the only one of this group of Mo's that was there in the village that I went to a couple months later in 2000, amongst the Mo's that I had met in Dongguan. She had actually gone back in the middle of the year. I think it was at the end of the summer, which was unusual, of course, because typically they would only go back during the Lunar New Year. But she had gone back because, for two reasons, really. One was to help her parents with a rice harvest. And so she was back helping them with that. But even more importantly, her identity card had expired. And at that point, particularly, the migrants were particularly vulnerable at their jobs in the cities. And one of the things that could happen to them was they could get picked up by the local police for any sort of, all sorts of different violations. Sometimes it seemed like the police were making up the violations as they went. And having an expired identity card was definitely one of the reasons they might get picked up. And then they'd get thrown into what China then called black jails, these custody and repatriation centers that were set up to house people in the cities that were usually migrants that got in some sort of trouble. And they were basically held in a form of a shakedown where they would have to pay a fine to be released. And that fine very often would amount to several months of their salary, their low wages in the factories. And this had actually happened to one of her cousins earlier, also a Mo from the same village. And so she made sure to go back and get her identity card renewed because she didn't want this to happen to her. So the other big event that we were all focused on that arguably played one of the most important roles in the the reform era in China, of course, was the entry to the World Trade Organization. And that was to come in December of 2001. If you remember, and I think Andrew was probably writing about this at the time, we already knew earlier than that China was going to enter at the end of 2001. The US and China signed the bilateral accession agreement between our two countries in late 1999. And that was the last really big important bilateral that China had to sign to enter. And so when I actually visited Binghuacun for the first time in 2000, they already knew that China was entering the World Trade Organization. And that actually was one of the reasons why they were open to me from the beginning, honestly. They thought that allowing a business reporter from abroad to come and talk to them potentially might bring later investment to their village. And on that first visit, I had a long conversation with the then village chief, who's now retired. I saw him a couple years ago, right before I left China. And he expressed the hope to me that they would have a vegetable processing factory, which would help them to move up the value chain in agriculture and make their village make the people of their village do much better with their livelihoods. So obviously WTO has a tremendous impact, as all of you know, on China's economy. It has also an undeniably important and impressive impact on improving the livelihoods of all Chinese people. And we see, along with all this money coming in and new factories being set up and more migrant workers leaving, more young people leaving the villages, becoming migrant workers, we see living standards go up across the country. The other big thing that's happening in China, which goes way back to Jiang Zemin's developed the West, is this massive infrastructure build out throughout the country. And this idea that, if we build our expressways and high-speed rail, not just along the coast, but deep into the hinterlands, that will also bring economic benefit. This is a picture in Guizhou. As some of you have probably visited will recognize these beautiful green mountains, which much of the province is covered with. Here's a new expressway, and this is just from a few years ago. The other thing I just note here is, if you look carefully at the picture, you can see an enormous billboard, and that's actually a huge billboard down by the expressway. It's a little hard to read. I can't read it right now because the characters are small, but the fact that it's red and gold, I think, is probably a hint to all of us that many of you would realize that it's a propaganda poster. And I think it might have been a Xi Jinping slogan. So we've seen, obviously, the propaganda push, like infrastructure, stretch deep into the Chinese countryside. As I said, there's been this undeniable and actually amazing progress in the Chinese economy, and also in the living standards of its people. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, 2021. And the Communist Party has set some very ambitious goals that they want to ensure that they meet by next year. And it looks like they're doing a very good job. So one of them is to eliminate absolute poverty. And they have basically done that by their standard already. Another one was to double GDP between 2010 and 2020. And I think they've just accomplished that. And the final one was to double disposable per capita incomes, I think it was, also during that time period. And they're going to do that, I think, even with COVID-19 and the slowdown in the economy. It looks like they're just barely going to meet that as well. So there's been this undeniable improvement in the living standards of people across China as the economy has grown in leaps and bounds over these years. But another statistic that I'd like to highlight, when I first started spending time in Southwest China and some of the more remote parts of the country 20 years ago, one of the numbers or the statistics that officials would tell me was that the gap between people from the countryside and the cities was about 3 to 1. So the people in the cities were making about 3 times as much on average as those from the countryside. And the reality is that gap really hasn't changed much. I think it might be something like 1 to 2.7 now or something. So there hasn't been much progress in narrowing that gap, which was a clear priority 20 years ago already. At the same time, there has been a dramatic increase in the wealth gap. And a lot of different inequality experts have looked into this, and they disagree in some cases about how extreme it is, but they all, it is clear that China does have a problem with its wealth gap. And Thomas Piketty, the noted inequality scholar himself, along with Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley, has also done research on this. One of the interesting things the two of them found was, according to their estimates, the wealth gap now is on par with autocratic Russia. And probably more alarmingly, the growth in the wealth gap is comparable also to the growth of what we've seen in Russia as well. So the big question I ask in my book is why, after all these years and the apparent serious intention of the Chinese government or the Communist Party to narrow this gap between the countryside and the cities, why does it still exist? And I really focus in on 2 legacy policies, and I say legacy because they date back to the Mao era. And as some of your audience know even better than I do, one of the most important ones, and I argue this in my book, is the household registration policy. And so, as again, many of you know, the household registration policy, depending on who you talk to, it goes back a very, very long time. But its modern form really came to rise in the 50s when Mao turned to the Soviet Union, as he liked to do, for instruction, and adopted it from what Stalin then was using in the then Soviet Union. And the household registration policy, despite all these changes, and despite this very dramatic change in the way it's been applied, which is during the Mao era, it was used to restrict people's movement around the country, keep the rural people in the communes where they could produce affordable, cheap grains and food for the people in the cities who were supposed to power the industrialization goals and fantasies of Mao. Now, of course, the household registration absolutely does not do that. As I said, we've got several 100 million people that have left the countryside despite the household registration policy, and the government in China is fine with that. But what they still do in most cases is tie the social welfare benefits of every Chinese person to the place where they, or more specifically, where their parents were born. What this means today in China is that in many cases, most cases, the people that come from rural China are not able to access the same level and quality of healthcare at the same price as people do in the cities, and they are not able to put their children into the same much better and much more affordable, if you compare them to the private schools that migrants have used in the cities for their children, schools. And this has played, as I argue in my book, and we can talk more about this in the question and answer session, played a very large role in sort of cementing this gap between the rural people that have the rural hukou or rural household registration and those from the cities. It's not only an economic issue. I argue and I really believe it's also a serious human rights issue, because what happens to most of the children of migrant workers, and depending on who you talk to, it's a very large number of kids that end up in this category, 60 million to maybe 100 million. Well, they grow up separate from their parents. They cannot go to the public schools with their parents, so they end up staying in the countryside. And whereas not too many years ago, many of them were attending school in these rundown village schools, maybe living with their grandparents, who were often illiterate, not really well prepared to raise children. Now, in more and more cases, most cases, they are in these very large and impersonal boarding schools. And the boarding schools were created by the government in Beijing, a well-meaning decision to pump more money into rural education, because they're maintaining, in most cases, the hukou policy, and they don't want these rural children, in most cases, to go to the urban public schools. So they've spent a lot of money trying to build these schools in the countryside, whereas the physical facilities may look quite impressive, and I visited a lot of them, and they often do. Unfortunately, the soft infrastructure of the teaching and the psychological issues that they have to deal with all these boarding kids are not so good at all. So the other policy, quickly, that I talk about in my book is the dual land policy, which again dates back to the Mao era. And basically what it is, in effect, is due to this continuing distinction between urban and rural land in China, you have this real split in different classes of people, how they've benefited from their ownership or holding over land. And what we've seen in the cities and has been written much about is this explosion of wealth as urban people have benefited from buying and selling apartments. In great contrast, we see in rural China that in most cases, neither the farmers that are still there nor the migrant workers who typically have a small plot of land back in the countryside, in most cases are not able to really properly monetize their land or sell it or rent it at market prices. That doesn't mean that some people in the countryside are not doing very well off selling rural land or buying and selling rural land, but that would be usually the local officials who are in effect able to redistrict the rural land from agricultural use to commercial use or industrial use, and then turn around and sell it to the developers. So ending here, this is one of my last pictures with Mo Rupoa. He, unlike many migrants, has opted to stay in the city. He's still living in Dongguan, not far from the where he worked as a welder, the Taiwanese-owned factory that I first visited in 2000. He and his wife, happens to be the same young woman, the woman that was pictured as much younger in the earlier picture, who was his girlfriend, who's from Hunan, are now married, and they have a small sports apparel business. They have their own brand, and it's a brand that not only, none of us would have ever heard of, but your average Beijing or person from Shanghai would have never heard of it either. A very, very small brand, and they source from factories and try to sell their sports apparel online. They were struggling, I have to say, when I last saw them. They rent a very small apartment. Buying in Dongguan is way beyond their reach. They run their office out of that small apartment. But the biggest headache for them was trying to decide what they would do with their daughter, who was about to turn 6 years old, and they were trying to decide where she would go to school. And the big concern that they had, and Mo Rupoa was adamant about, and his wife as well, was that she not become a left-behind child as the children of migrant workers who stay back in the countryside are called, and that she would stay in the city with them. That meant that they would have to put her in one of these private schools that have sprouted up to educate the children of migrant workers. The problem there was not only those schools typically of far lower quality, but they're also actually quite expensive. So let me stop there. I probably talked longer than I should have. And then I'll hand it back to Andrew and Dory, and we can get on to the more interesting part of tonight.
Yeah, I think Dory should ask the first question, actually. Do you want to kick it off? Dory, are you online? Okay. Okay, so I guess I'll use the moderator's privilege to direct the questioning a little bit. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, okay.
There you are. Go ahead.
I was wondering if Tiff could stop share screen so that we can do the gallery view, and that's great. So thanks so much, Tiff. Those are really fantastic pictures, and having read the book also, it just really brings it to life when you can see their faces and really get your view of their lives, and your stories about them are wonderful. I really appreciate that. I wanted to start with my first question about sort of the conclusion that you draw. Many American business people don't know much about migrant workers because they really don't come in contact with them in the course of doing their business. So but you draw that together at the end as to why we all should care more about the migrant workers, and you talk about you've followed many of the strikes and protests, and you talk about the possibility of widespread dissension as migrant workers get more unhappy, and how that could lead to what you call a wounded China with an ever more anemic economy, and that kind of instability is what really ought to concern us. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that and tell us really how likely of an outcome you think that is. That obviously you don't see that China's growth is just going to keep going and doubling in the next 15 years like Xi Jinping wants, but it's faced some serious headwinds. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so I guess I would start by just pointing out that the myth of Chinese capitalism of my title, I'm sort of really talking about several different myths in my mind. And one is that this very tremendous and important economic reform that we saw unleashed starting back in 1979, that it unleashed this amazing productivity in the economy, you know, that we're still on that trajectory. And I would argue that if we look back, you know, probably since about, at least, you know, you can find different dates, but clearly been true for the last 7 or 8 years. It doesn't seem to me that we're necessarily on that trajectory anymore. At the same time, and I think this really gets to what you just mentioned about sort of the assumptions of the world and the assumptions of multinationals around the world, the idea that China will somehow continue to mint an ever larger middle class, and that this growing middle class that so much that China's been reliant on, and the world and the world's multinationals have been reliant on for growth, that will continue to happen without actual serious reform again. I push back against that notion. I don't think that that's really going to happen without finally moving on to these key leftover legacy policies that are holding back the growth of the middle class. So I guess I would say that I'm the first part of your question was, you were just pointing out the dissension. Is that whether I see dissension coming? I mean, that what I've just said makes me think that, I mean, we all know that China is not going to have the sort of growth in the economy that we've seen in the last few decades. And I think the world's waking up to that. But what I worry is that without these real reforms, we could see an actual real stagnation in growth. And I'm not predicting that by any means that's going to bring about a revolution or the collapse of China. And there's way too many examples of others that have predicted that and proven themselves absolutely wrong. But I do think that there is this growing tension within the country because of the fact that economic growth is now slowing. I mean, I argue that there's been this implicit bargain between the party, which says we, the party, will guarantee ever higher and rapidly growing standards of living for everyone. And you know, you in turn, the people, will not actually be serious about demanding real civil rights, certainly not democracy, and so on. And that bargain, I think, has actually been framed for some time for a significant portion of the population, which is migrants and rural people. And I think going forward, we're going to see ever more pressure on that bargain, because I just don't see that kind of growth going forward. I do write about in the book, as you said, sort of the rise of a labor movement, which I followed closely in the first part of, I guess, starting around 2010 or so. Well, that was very brutally squashed by the government under Xi Jinping, and basically doesn't exist anymore. Many of the people that were these barefoot lawyers, as they referred to them, often former factory workers who self-trained in law and then started helping out other workers, are now in jail. So, that source of dissension, I think, has been squashed to a degree. I just say one last thing quickly. When I used to talk, and I spent a lot of time talking to workers and labor activists during that era when it was growing, one of the things that the activists would say to me was, the party should be thankful for us. We are, like, in effect, a pressure valve that is moderating between workers that are being abused and between factory managers or local governments that are abusing them. And we're giving them an avenue other than going down to the local government office and, you know, burning some police cars, which sometimes happened, or at the very least blocking traffic. And so they should be thankful for us. Well, that sort of pressure valve has been taken away, and I don't think that's good for the stability of China going forward.
Tiff, if I could, I want to, I guess, push a little bit on some of the arguments in your book. So we, you know, I think you show really clearly, you know, that a lot of these migrant workers, they have pretty tough lives. They have a lot of difficulties in how they make their life choices and what they can do for their families because of these restrictions imposed by the government. You show us that there, you know, there's a lot of big inequality between rural and urban populations. I guess I want, I kind of wonder, yes, I agree we should all be concerned about these problems, but is it really the case that these problems are somehow going to cripple China's economic growth going forward? And why should we think that? If we look at like the U.S. today, right? We have very severe rural poverty in the U.S. So that's also the case in many places in Europe. So these countries that are otherwise very rich, very successful, much richer than China, they haven't solved the problem of inequality between rural and urban areas. They haven't solved the problem of rural poverty, and it doesn't seem to have prevented them from becoming successful otherwise. So I just wonder if maybe is this going to be the kind of problem that China just struggles with for a long time, rather than being something that stops it in its tracks?
Well, I mean, I would point out that the party itself has been talking for a long time about this as a serious problem, and not as a human rights problem in most cases, but as a serious economic challenge for China going forward. And as you know, probably spent more time looking at this than I have. China's struggling to. China's been talking for at least a decade about its intention and the necessity of moving towards a more domestic consumption driven economy. And there's been this growing realization that the old, more export investment oriented model cannot function going forward. And this, I would argue, has become even more clear to the government and even more of an imperative over the course of the last couple of years with the trade war, now with COVID-19. And now that we've even got a new slogan that sort of supposed to solidify this, which is the dual circulation strategy, right? And we're hearing from Xi Jinping himself about the necessity of boosting domestic consumption in the economy. So they haven't done very well so far, obviously. I think it's still below 40% or so of GDP, domestic consumption as a proportion of GDP. And I argue in the book that this has a lot to do with this system still in place in China that basically ensures that some 1/2 the population, because of hukou and dual land policy, are kept as second-class citizens. And the government itself, at least since the third plenum in, 2013, they have said very clearly, we will not make this transition unless we reform the dual land system and the household registration system. And they're, as you know, we all know, they're extremely intelligent policymakers there. Having said that, and having, and recognizing the fact that they see the problem and they've announced that they're going to change things, I think they've done actually very, very little with either of those policies over the last 7 years. And I think I would argue that's, the fact that they have made so little progress, and there's a lot of reasons why it's difficult to do it, which we can talk about as well. But the fact that they've made so little progress, I would argue, is, has had the direct result that they've struggled to actually make this economic transition. And so I actually see it as something that is very challenging for China going forward. I would also note that, yes, without doubt, there are great gaps between urban and rural in other countries around the world. I do think China is unique in that it has a system in place, which, by the way, migrant workers seem to be, from my experience talking to them, are increasingly aware of and resent, that basically keeps them in this place. There seems to be, my experience again, and this is anecdotal, but over a lot of years, is that there's growing resentment about the fact that they feel like the system, if it doesn't change, is going to hold back their futures.
There are a lot of really great questions in the chat. So I'd like to relay just one of them initially, but there are a lot of good ones. Jerry Straub says, I have several Chinese friends who moved from their home city not a rural city, but to Shanghai or Beijing, married and did not seem to have problems with schools or access to healthcare. Is that because they marry someone to gain that advantage, or why is it that some people have a problem with that and some people don't?
Well, marriage is traditionally the best way to get urban hukou. So if you marry marry a person who has urban hukou, you can transfer that, and that's actually been a funny phenomena as college students get ready to finish university. And if they don't have a job at a big, traditionally, if they don't have a job at a big state enterprise that can dole out a limited number of urban hukous, the other option has been to marry a local. And there's a funny dynamic there that I think still exists in China today. So that is a key way that people have obtained urban hukou. I would point out that it's, far off and extremely difficult and not an option for most rural migrant workers. The other thing you've got in China, which is distressing, is and very distressing. I find it very distressing. There's a real urban bias, I think, that goes back decades now, before even Deng Xiaoping, back to the Mao era, where rural people are looked down upon, and so you have almost, as the expression, those of you who speak Chinese, calling someone 外地人 or 农民, an outsider or a farmer is an insult in the cities, and that was one of the most striking things that I discovered when I moved to Beijing after having studied Mao's revolution in college at Stanford, and hearing about the great revolution of the masses, was this deep bias against rural people.
Tiff, I wanted to kind of follow up on that. I think a lot of the interesting bits in your book are about the history of China, and you've got like some great tidbits from Fei Xiaotong, the great Chinese anthropologist who wrote about rural areas in the 1940s. And I'm wondering, like, how do you connect that history to what's going on today? Because you're focusing in on this problem that the Chinese leadership, they've identified a structural problem that they should change, and yet it seems politically very difficult for them to actually implement that change. So what's the source of that difficulty? What are the political barriers, and where do you think they come from?
Well, yeah, I don't know how it connects to Fei Xiaotong. Fei Xiaotong was very interesting to me because he was so open-minded for his time, and had these, actually had proposals about how to, improve rural economies or village economies, and also bring more accountability and almost have like a rural or village level democracy. And his reward for doing that was to be purged in the anti-rightist movement and spend the next few decades of his life out of the academic mainstream, and only then was resurrected with the death of Mao, and came back a chastened individual who would never talk about political reform in the countryside again, which I found fascinating, particularly as we see the increasing tightening over all sorts of political thought in China today. But some of the practical reasons why I think they're struggling so much with the reform of these two policies. One, there's, as I said earlier, I wouldn't pretend that it's easy, and there are real challenges. I think one big one with the household registration system, as you know, the social welfare costs in China largely are borne by the localities, by the cities themselves or the townships, and there's this perception amongst the cities that if they were to actually integrate fully the migrants and their children and their families into the cities, that the cost would be exorbitant. So bringing their medical care and the school system up so that it also served them would be very, very expensive. And so there's fair enough. There's some people that argue in China that actually the cost would not be so high because the migrants are hardworking and they could become taxpayers and they would pay their own way. But there is this perception that it would be expensive. The other, getting back to this sort of rural bias, which is unfortunate, but I think is real in China today. This is not exactly the rural bias, but Another obstacle is actually the urban residents themselves. And so we've seen in recent years protests actually by urban parents against well-meaning efforts by the central government to bring more migrant kids into urban schools. We saw that in Nanjing, for example, a few years ago, where the parents, the city parents actually went and marched outside the Department of Education and said, keep the kids out. We don't want them in our cities. And I think that's a real problem in China today. I don't think, you know plenty of urbanites, plenty of people from China. And I think in most cases, if you told your average city person in China, what do you think? Shouldn't the migrants be allowed to live here if they so desire? In most cases, the answer would be, of course not. What a ridiculous idea. Keep them out of the cities. So it's very much a part of society there as well. And then I think finally there is this really, on the political side, I think there's this deeply internalized sort of fear amongst the party about the free flow of people around the country. And they used to refer to earlier migrations, pre-Deng Xiaoping, like during the Great Leap Forward, when people left the countryside because they were starving, as blind flow. So this blind flow of people. Yeah, and you even in more recent years, I mean, in the at least in the early 90s, you would see that in Chinese official documents about, maybe even much more recent, I'm not sure. Cam Ling Chen from the University of Washington, who I know is in the audience, he probably knows this, but it may be an expression that's used today as well. So there's this fear amongst the party that allowing people to actually decide where they want to live is going to be deeply destabilizing.
You mentioned just a minute ago about poverty elimination. And a lot of Americans are very, very impressed that China was able to eliminate dire poverty. But now that they've reached that goal, or at least as close as they could get in 2020, do you think that Xi Jinping will then look at the elimination of sort of not quite so dire poverty as another goal?
I think so. I mean, they do have these goals. So they talk about a moderately prosperous society, 小康社会, and they've set a target for when they should reach their definition of a moderately prosperous society. And then another centenary goal, I think it was by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. They had a goal to, have an advanced society with a certain income level to match that. And I believe that, with the latest 5-year plan, when they also announced this plan for 2035, they've moved forward some of those goals to do away with, certain categories of low income people in the country as well. So I think they'll continue to do that. And I think that is, to their credit, I think there's a realization that it isn't good. And there's idealistic people certainly in the party as well, who and I would imagine, and I think Xi Jinping himself doesn't like the idea that it would be a deeply unequal society. So there's an idealistic side to it as well. And then I think, as I said earlier, I think there's a real practical economic realization that they need to do this in order for economic stability and for an economically sustainable economy.
So maybe this is too hard of a question, but who do you think is kind of ultimately responsible for the state of migrant workers in China? Is it the capitalists who employ them, the factory owners who run sweatshops, who don't keep labor conditions up to international standards, or is it the communists who are in charge of the government and are putting these different rules and restrictions around people's lives? Like, kind of what's the balance between the the kind of standard capitalist exploitation that you might see anywhere, in the kind of specific communist features that are in China?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and we've seen a real improvement in terms of the working conditions for most workers in factories, but that didn't happen because of the good-hearted multinationals or Taiwanese and Hong Kong factory owners. That was real pressure often exerted from abroad through the anti-sweatshop movement, the fact that these big multinationals, discovered that it could be very damaging to them and even to their bottom line if they were exposed globally as producing goods based on the blood and sweat, as Chinese workers describe it, of their toil. And so there was improvement, and that also was spurred by putting much better labor laws in place in China, which was also a good thing that happened, and which I write about in the book. But ultimately, I do think that the party itself is responsible for this situation. And again, it goes back to these legacy policies. I think that they talk a lot and they seem determined to try to deal with some of the problems. And they've spent a lot of money on trying to improve, as I said earlier, rural education, rural health as well. But ultimately, I think they need to face up to the fact that they're only going to make a certain amount of limited progress if they don't deal with these underlying legacy policies that are decades old. So I think that ultimately the blame, if you want to put it that way, lies there. I also think if you look at sort of the piecemeal efforts that have been made towards hukou reform, for example, the Chinese Communist Party and the government has made very clear where their priorities are. So you see this top-down thing where certain cities have opened to migrants, but those cities certainly are not Beijing or Shanghai or even many of the provincial capitals where the jobs might be and where probably most of the migrants would like to go. Indeed, if you look, you'll see that in many cases, they're actually trying to drive the migrants out of those places. And so Beijing and Shanghai have both set, population targets, which are actually reduction, not just stopping the growth of the populations, but reducing it. And I think that's, clearly the desire of the party. And I don't think it's the way to seriously go about trying to deal with these legacy policies in China.
A question from Gary Ogen, who says, is the difference between rural and urban labor a factor, or wages? He had heard that workers in rural factories earning 40 cents an hour gain a skill and then move to Shanghai and get $2 an hour and then are able to move up that way.
Well, there's been a huge lift in living standards for people that hail from rural China simply by becoming migrants, without question. That's why they do it. They go to the cities and they earn more money. So that's a very good thing, and that'll continue. Although, as was written in the Wall Street Journal recently, I have a whole chapter in my book about there's a push now to try to get those rural people, the migrants that have moved to the cities, to go home, which I think is a deeply, deeply problematic policy, but something I was writing about quite a while ago. But indeed, yeah, this has been a way to improve your fortunes, to make that move and go to a place where wages are higher. And at the same time, we've also seen factories move into the interior in response to higher costs on the coast, and that's been good for migrants who then, or for rural workers then, that don't necessarily have to move so far away from their relatives back in their home villages, but actually can maybe find a job nearby in that same province. And so that's been a positive thing as well.
Oh, he's clarifying that his question is that differential a reason to slow migration? Differential in the salaries.
A reason from the party's perspective? I'm not sure I understand.
Maybe Gary could unmute himself and explain exactly what that question is.
Well, my question is related to the fact that factories have, in the rural communities, were hiring unskilled labor, training them to do a basic job, and paying them minimal wage, like 30 or 40 cents an hour. Once these workers gain skills, they then have the ability to go to a big city and make more money. that put those factories at great risk, and they had something like 250% turnover rates. Now, these corporations put pressure on the central government to do things to keep those people from migrating away from the low-paying jobs?
Okay, I see your question. I don't think that, I mean, typically the rural or the interior factories would not be particularly well connected. They certainly wouldn't, you know, there are multinationals moving to the interior, but in many cases, those would be more focused on the coast. I don't think there has been an effort by, or I don't think that they've had an impact in changing central policy to try to limit migration. On a separate note, I mean, the real hope of the government as well, which I haven't mentioned yet, is that obviously there's a big transition now for migrant workers, as for everyone in China, into much more service jobs. And we actually have more migrant workers today working in the service economy than in factories or on construction sites, which is where almost all of them used to work. And the hope is, and the government has talked a lot about this, that this transition will be a good one that helps them achieve their goal of not just creating a more domestic consumption-driven economy, but a more service-driven economy, and that those jobs will be of value and will pay the migrants a good salary. But there's been very interesting research out of, I think out of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology has done a lot of good research on this that shows that those new service jobs that migrant workers are working in most cases are not very good service jobs at all. And it'll come as no surprise to many of you that one of the very biggest, most important new jobs for migrant workers moving into the service economy is motorcycle delivery. The people that zip around the cities and make an okay amount of money, but not that much. But more importantly, have a really, really unpleasant, difficult job because they're under pressure to deliver a certain number of goods, you know, in a certain amount of time, and will get fined if they don't do it. Also a dangerous job. There's a lot of traffic accidents and injuries of migrant workers now working in these delivery jobs.
Right. It's interesting that you're actually seeing some of the same dynamics in China that you've already seen in the US, where you've got this shift from, you know, pretty stable, like pretty well-paying, you know, manufacturing jobs to like much less stable service jobs kind of associated with the gig economy, right? So in the US, this is, you know, played out over this kind of multi-decade time frame, and in China, it's kind of telescoped, right? You know, because they're still heavily, you know, manufacturing based, but then they've also got this very fast developing gig economy, you know, which particularly this year because of COVID, right, it's been a big explosion in the in delivery driver employment.
Yeah, and we're seeing we're actually seeing, you know, growing worker protest amongst these new delivery workers as well. So in response to the unfortunate conditions that many of them are working under.
And Noor has a follow-on question on that, saying that there were talks recently that delivery drivers, mostly migrants, were going to strike due to poor wages. And do you see a movement of resentment among migrant workers that is gaining traction even now, I guess, under the pandemic?
I think that there is evidence that there have been more strikes by delivery workers in China, and something called China Labor Bulletin down in Hong Kong, which does the best job probably of monitoring strikes across China, has done a number of reports showing the surge in new strikes for delivery workers. But I do think the space to speak out or protest has been, you know, badly compromised by the clampdown under the party and Xi Jinping in recent years. So I think they will continue to protest, but whether I think their ability to have a meaningful strike movement or to link up across cities, for example, those sorts of things are far less likely now than they were a number of years ago.
Okay. I think I have a feeling that Nora is going to come in and call time on us pretty quickly. So I don't know. Tiff, do you have any kind of closing thoughts you want to share with people? Maybe do you have an since your book was published this year, obviously before we had this whole huge kind of disruption of COVID across China, which China's bounced back from very quickly compared to some other places. But do you has the way this year has played out, has that kind of changed your thinking about any of the stuff that's in your book?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, my book, it came out on March 10th. I was in New York. We already knew about COVID, but we didn't know how bad it was in the US. And I had to cut short my activities in New York. The book launch I was going to have at the Asia Society with large crowds, I was hoping, was just me and Tom Nagorski, the executive vice president, sitting in a room pretending like we were speaking to an audience, and it was being live streamed. So New York was shutting down when I was there. So obviously nowhere in my book do I mention COVID-19, but I do think that actually some of the arguments I make have a new urgency with COVID-19. And I've written about this a bit, actually in your former employer, a piece I did in the Wall Street Journal, and also a piece I did in Foreign Affairs earlier this year. I look at what COVID really means for migrant workers and reform in China. And I think that it sort of presents, it makes the challenge, the need to make this transition to a new economy much more urgent for the government. They can't rely on the rest of the world to the degree that which they have in the past. And they've made it very clear that they recognize that. And I think there's really sort of two alternate paths going forward. And the positive one, which I very much hope they take, is that because they know that they need to be more self-reliant, they find a way to make the economy work better for everyone, not just the people in the cities. And that therefore will help them have a much more vibrant domestic market. And that will help the people of China, all the people, and drive growth into the future. The alternate possibility is sort of this more nativistic pushback against further reform. And unfortunately, we've seen some evidence of that already, where there seem to be heightened fears about migrant workers throughout China. Earlier during COVID, there were efforts to actually block migrants from returning to their homes in the cities, in some cases very heavy-handed, like cutting off the electricity or water in apartments where migrant workers were living to keep them out. And I fear that second tendency is probably just as likely, that they push back and they continue to struggle with making these very necessary reforms.
Thanks, Steph. Nora, do you want to come in with some closing remarks?
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you again, Tiff, and our moderators for a really good session. I'd like to note that our next session that's scheduled is December 7th with Matt Chitwood, who's online with us today, and he's going to be talking about his experiences living in rural China. I think living among some of the people that were left behind. That maybe the families migrated and he lived in the village where the oldsters and the young kids were still left. So that would be on the same theme. And I think those of you that found today's session of interest will certainly enjoy that. Again, I think Matt or Tiff would love it if we all went out and ran and bought his book. So hopefully this has encouraged you to do that.
Absolutely.
And again, thanks very much for the participants and particularly for the presenters. I think it was a really good session. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Steph.
And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you, everybody.
Appreciate your intelligent, incisive moderating.
Yeah, great thanks to the moderators. Okay. Good night, everyone.